Hello everyone, my name's Lewis and I'm hugely grateful to the Erotic Art London team for putting this fantastic exhibition on for us all and for inviting me to give this talk. So a bit about me before I get into it. I'm a visual artist from London and I recently graduated from the Royal College of Art. My work represents longings and desires to feel understood, held and loved by myself as well as other people. My obsession is with the male form as my subject, and I use drawing and printmaking as tools to bear my psychological nakedness by deconstructing and reconstructing nude others. And how does this relate to Erotic Art London? Well, my artworks spotlight gay male bodies and relationships, whereby I believe that implicit eroticism has the potential, through visibility and social commentary, to be a positive force across society. My queer stance influences how I create, such as in printmaking, where I favour monoprints and small runs over large editions, as a subversive challenge against the heteronormative social values placed on reproducibility. Over the 30 minutes of this talk, I'll be focusing on the visual arts. I'm going to guide you through my perspective on the erotic as informed by writer, philosopher and activist Audre Lorde's positioning, before exploring what may be unique about the erotic within the context of the gay male gaze and gay male form. Next, I'll look at the work of 4 different visual artists to consider how the modern and contemporary male nude has been perceived and portrayed by a selection of gay male creative practitioners, before finally sharing how the erotic relates to my own work and what role it has to play in my personal journey of creative evolution, something to which many other creatives in the room may be able to relate. And just to say, I'll be taking all questions at the end rather than throughout. So to start off, I think it's important to consider the concept of the erotic and define it within the context of this talk. Having researched numerous artworks and perspectives more broadly on nudity, intimacy and the erotic, Audre Lorde's thinking on this subject resonated with me most deeply because of its expansive approach. Recognising the sexual as part of the erotic, but incorporating so many more aspects of life too. For those unfamiliar with her career, Audre Lorde has been described as an American writer, professor, philosopher, intersexual feminist, poet and civil rights activist. By her own terms, she proudly stated her identity as black, lesbian, feminist, socialist mother, warrior, and poet. Her essay, Uses of the Erotic, has gone on to play a fundamental role in the development of my work, and especially how I interpret others' artworks of the male nude, and it's therefore the text I've used to conceptualise the erotic for this talk. In the essay, Lorde discusses the erotic as being deeply core to the essence of ourselves and a source of great personal power. Exploring her ideas through her own lens, as a black queer feminist, it's important to mention that she sees the erotic as a very feminine characteristic and power within each of us, and that, in addition to her black queer feminist framework, her ideas are equally relevant to other groups who have experienced marginalisation and oppression, including gay men, my lens of focus for this talk. In Uses of the Erotic, Lorde defines the term erotic outside of the sexual parameters within which it's often restrained, instead deconstructing the concept in terms of its power. She says, "The erotic is a measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings. Having experienced the fullness of this depth of feeling, and recognizing its power, in honour and self-respect, we can require no less of ourselves." Moreover, she builds on this conceptual framing, speaking of the erotic as more broadly encompassing joy, energy, vivacity, interconnectedness to the self and one's authentic desires, a resource and power, rooted in femininity, to be drawn upon and used. Lorde therefore proposes that when applied more broadly across all aspects of our life, the erotic empowers us. She writes, "This is one reason why the erotic is so feared and so relegated, often to the bedroom alone, when it is recognised at all. For once we begin to feel deeply all the aspects of our lives, we begin to demand from ourselves and from our life pursuits that they feel in accordance with that joy which we know ourselves to be capable of." However, this innate natural power arguably exists at odds with the values and social conditioning of many contemporary capitalist societies, where the focus of life's journey may more often be placed on social expectations and individualist financial security rather than embracing deep-rooted passions and the erotic nature of our own human selves. Laud proposes, "We have been raised to fear the yes within ourselves, our deepest cravings, yet to suppress any truth is to give it strength beyond endurance." If we take this proposal as true and view it through a more socialist paradigm, it has intertwined implications at both the societal and individual levels. Individually, the decision to embrace our deepest cravings and truth provides the strength to align our emotional self with our life pursuits. Societally, this shift occurring for many individuals would also become a direct resistance against the values and functioning of many contemporary capitalist societies. So here we can see the erotic, as we know, is sexual, but it is also broader and a power to be harnessed in ourselves, in our lives, even in our artwork, as we can see in this exhibition today at Erotic Art London. I'll return to this point again shortly. But now, before we explore the implications of the erotic in today's world more deeply, it's important to first situate our present-day reality within the context of the physical appreciation of the male form versus eroticism versus pornography. To do so, in exploring the gay male form, we must consider how the focus and accentuation of different features of the male body in artworks have contributed towards society's understanding and assumptions today. Historically, the civilizations of the ancient Greeks and Romans played a significant role in placing artwork of the male form at the centre of society, through statues and drawings, often of their various leaders. Over this period of history, to be depicted with a smaller phallus was often seen as more desirable, because this was considered less animalistic and therefore representative of greater intellectual capabilities. And different leaders had varying perspectives on whether the genitals should be shown or instead covered with a leaf, even informing our own perceptions of censorship today. Consistent across these differing works, however, is the reality that these societies' ruling classes were always created through a lens in which muscularity and athleticism was an exaggerated focal point. Often positioned on plinths far above the viewer, these were techniques which spoke to the dominance the sculpture's subjects held over all civilians in their societies, by giving a clear physical impression that power is intrinsic to every part of their being as rulers. Of course, this was a time when, without photography, many everyday people never have ended up seeing their leaders in the flesh, let alone accurately represented. The legacy of these arguably partially falsified and partially idealized versions of the male form has continued to be concentrated even further in Western society since then, up until the 20th century, emergence of modern and contemporary art movements, such as Impressionism, Expressionism, and Abstraction. For example, in 19th and 20th century Parisian drawing schools, there was a strong focus on academically accurate depictions of the human anatomy and form. However, these students learned to draw by copying from casts and moulds of parts of the body, often for months or sometimes years before being allowed to start working with a life model. But many of these casts and moulds were based on representations rooted as far back as statues from ancient Greek and Roman societies, which in turn therefore informed the work of Renaissance figurative artists and then these Parisian drawing schools. By briefly tracing the evolution and stagnation of representations of the male nude in art history, it's also possible to infer how the persistence of such exaggerated muscular depictions may have maintained systems of oppression, such as those of gender-based violence and fear, through the culturally dominant visual languages we internalize. Therefore, when considering the appreciation of the male form in art, eroticism, and even pornography, I believe it's important to simultaneously engage in the histories of male nude depictions and what they may implicitly continue to contribute towards our understanding today. Moving on to the present day, and specifically the gay male form, I believe that insights from wider social and psychological fields can be helpful in how we position the bodies which are shown in culturally more mainstream artworks. Research shows that gay men experience higher levels of body dissatisfaction compared to their heterosexual counterparts, with their self-comparison focusing more greatly on muscularity than weight. These negative effects in the modern age partially result from media imagery of idealised male physiques detrimentally affecting gay men's body image, and minority stress factors, including internalised homophobia, which is estimated to account for up to 13% of so-called masculine body ideal distress. The impact of such influences is stark. One 2016 study, aggregating data from more than 115,000 men, determined that for gay men, 45% were dissatisfied with their muscularity, compared to 30% for heterosexuals. Moreover, gay men were 6 times more likely to avoid sex due to body dissatisfaction, 4 times more frequently considered plastic surgery, 3 times more likely to use diet pills, and within the time span of 1 year, twice as many had dieted. As an important side note, the pressure for alignment towards societally and sub-societally idealised beauty standards is not a challenge unique to gay men alone. The politics of representation is felt widely and more disproportionately by most marginalised groups. However, what becomes more unique when considering gay male body image is the socio-political and historical contextualisation, that during the 1980s and 90s, this community globally experienced the emotional and physical trauma of the prospect or reality of death, alongside the witnessing of friends' fatal health declines caused by AIDS and the associated inaction of governments and pharmaceutical companies. Whilst the hard and literal images of the ideal homosexual had already been constructed by artists, like the rightly celebrated Tom of Finland, and photographers featured in the USA-based magazine Physique Pictorial, in the aftermath of AIDS' invisible deadly threat, some psychotherapists have proposed that for gay men, physical perfection became shorthand for health, survival, and vitality, thereby heightening the subconscious desire for muscularity. So now, having considered these historical contexts and their potential effects on depicted gay male bodies today, let's move on to explore how the modern and contemporary male nude has frequently been perceived and portrayed by gay male creative practitioners. In my research on the male nude, I've often found that portrayals fall mostly into one of these two camps. The first, an intentionally academic gaze to show the subject with scientifically anatomical accuracy, or the second, a sexualized gaze to show the subjects in a marginally pornographic light. Whilst not openly positioned as such by the artists themselves, I've observed that the latter often centres on the penis as the primary subject, whilst the person is just a secondary subject. This is an approach which I personally feel can do the artist and the artwork a disservice. Like in traditional Christian artworks, such as Angelico's The Annunciation, the penis becomes a contemporary homosexual iteration of the transcendent object of the halo, whose very inclusion in the composition is what actually gives the work its core meaning. In turn, when it comes to the male nude in a secular context, phallic centricity arguably detracts from other motifs and meanings embedded into the work as one whole entity. Frankly, I don't believe that the erect penis nor evidence of orgasms in any portrayed gender or subject should be a cause for taboo by the sole nature of its depiction. After all, these phenomena are a direct mirroring of most people's lived experience. However, once the aroused genital ceases to become one of multiple devices in the composition, but instead becomes the primary focus of a work in a way which is explicit for its own sake, I believe that often the artist unintentionally undermines the rest of their craftsmanship. Simultaneously, shock, alert, and repulsion are experienced by most people upon seeing such an artwork unexpectedly, reducing the piece to the visualization of the tools of sex, not the implicit emotions which lay behind this in the rest of the subject's form and its physical contextualization. As the earlier mentioned Audre Lorde convincingly argued, and I quote, "Pornography is a direct denial of the power of the erotic, for it represents the suppression of true feeling. Pornography emphasizes sensation without feeling." Taking my perspective on this matter into consideration, I feel there are several practitioners whose work strikes a particularly tender balance in implicitly portraying nuanced gay male eroticism in the nude form. I'm going to take a look at 4 of these visual artists, painters David Hockney and Gavin Dobson, and photographers George Platt-Lynes and Cole Fawcett. I've chosen Hockney and platt-lynes because they are practitioners whose work has significantly influenced approaches to visualizations of the male form throughout the 20th century. Whilst conversely, Dobson and Fawcett are emerging practitioners whose work, I believe, has the potential to excitingly shape the cutting edge of visual language in conveying the male nude. Across the discipline of painting, renowned artist David Hockney and emerging talent Gavin Dobson astutely designed their compositions to place the focus on the emotional charge of a moment in time, with the nude state of a man being one aspect of this rather than playing a solely sexual role. Starting with Hockney, in his pieces Man in Shower Beverly Hills and Two Men in a Shower, he uses the context of the shower to portray an everyday environment with the intimacy introduced. In the work Man in Shower Beverly Hills, featuring just one man, the viewer is invited to see the subject as an object of desire, perhaps even their own object of desire. Whilst for the piece titled Two Men in a Shower, the desire exists solely between those two portrayed subjects, with the viewer now merely an onlooker. In the first, it is as if the viewer can be placing themselves there as a participant, whereas in the second, they are a fly on the wall. In times when to be openly gay presented greater societal danger, and cruising was therefore a popular means by necessity for gay men to find intimacy, through both these artworks I interpret Hockney to be playing with the related ideas of behind closed doors, the multiple interpretations for what it means for a man to be wet in the shower, and the shrouding of identity whilst in the viewer's gaze, yet all without portraying sex or the phallus explicitly. This is a feat of communicating his themes and sense of desire with great effect, whilst ensuring the artwork would be received without accusations of excessive sexualization within the social attitudes of the 1960s society in which he was creating. Taking emerging artists today in London, Gavin Dobson similarly, through his paintings Waiting Naked and Erotes, employs nudity to set the broader context of interpretation for his pieces. It's my interpretation that he specifically uses the subject's gaze as a device to elicit feelings of longing and desire, with a background of lingering self-consciousness, perhaps even subconscious shame from internalized homophobia. In relation to the other figures in the composition, or the figures we can imagine but are yet to be introduced, the focus is not on nudity, arousal, or sex for its own sake. The nude form is one layer of meaning among many, each applied intentionally. Earlier this week, Dobson published a short essay on his Pool Boys series of artworks, in which he addresses what he terms as being the eroticized male body. He says, and I quote, "I spent a lifetime surrounded by the sexualization of women. I craved a framing which put the male form on display. It was a joy to work into these paintings. Here I was painting these men who I was their master, their creator. My initial, almost superficial focus on their bodies themselves waned. I became less interested in capturing a beautiful man and more interested in a wider narrative of beauty." Some of his artworks are situated in environments similar to Hockney's domestic showers, and in Dobson's creation of essentially charged bedroom and gym changing room scenes, it's interesting to understand that whilst his primary centering is on displaying the male form, he, like Hockney, also moves beyond the superficial focus of physicality to instead explore and convey wider narratives within his implicitly erotic artworks. I believe that this multiplicity of meaning adds a depth of emotional experience for the artist and viewer alike, which enables a more nuanced and, in my view, more impactful impression of the art to be formed. Moving on now to two fine art photographers, the creatives George Platt-Lynes and Cole Fawcett, both uniquely navigate the tensions of appreciative, erotic and non-pornographic desire in ways which resonate with me deeply and effectively incorporate these erotic undertones as just one of several elements. George Platt-Lynes was a 20th century photographer whose studio work introduced me to new ways of perceiving the body, through my research on how his life influenced his work, his imagery, and the intentions behind them. For instance, his untitled archival photos on the slide here leave the viewer with the tangible sense of an intangible emotional suspension between the two men spotlighted in each image. In the third image, Charles Tex Smutney and Charles Budley Stanley B, the way in which the man is lying slumped across the legs and groin of the other creates an image which evokes such varied emotional interpretation that it could equally have been taken in the immediate aftermath of sunbathing, sleeping, sex, despair, or more. This unique energy of various delicate connections is instilled with ambiguity, which Platt-Lynes created through the interaction of the model's poses and gazes, and often had an undertone of desire or sexual tension, while simultaneously leaving space for so much more. Moving on to a contemporary practitioner, Cole Fawcett is producing what I personally find to be some of the most exciting imagery of the male form today. I've grouped him with Platt-Lynes as I see him as a conceptual and visual peer of a different period in time, situating his work within the context of the non-aroused, yet highly arousing, erotic. He achieves this by pushing the balance to the implicit sharp edges between emotional resonance and dissonance, lived experience, and the exploration of extraordinary physical forms in intentionally situated contexts. Take, for example, his Late Checkout series, shown here. Across these three images, the partially or fully nude male form introduces the basis of the erotic, yet Fawcett shapes this and pushes it further by astutely using physical objects and cropping as interventions which heighten the viewer's intrigue. A breakfast tray, a translucent curtain, or a shower head, in each instance with the genitals covered or cropped out. Ultimately, I would suggest that this creates greater impact with his audiences, because the partially seen body represents a tangible reality towards which desire builds, while simultaneously his viewer is able to project their fantasies, perhaps even subconsciously, onto the unseen elements of the figure which lie outside of the camera's gaze. Finally, to bring this talk to a close, I want to briefly share some insights from my own creative journey from the past 5 years, specifically exploring how the erotic, as framed by Audre Lorde's perspective, relates to my work. Personally, I find that Lorde's compelling framing of the erotic as a measure between ourself and our strongest feelings, and an indication of the natural cravings and yes within ourself which we should not fear, is an interpretation which feels deeply personal to my experiences. Starting out on my journey towards becoming an artist, it was my own prolonged episodes of rejection of my deepest feelings, such as repressed sexuality and workaholism, which moved me to the undesirable place of what Lorde defines as being satisfied with suffering and self-negation and with the numbness of life. It wasn't until I finally mustered the courage over the years to start to feel and later embrace my deepest feelings that I metaphorically woke up and began to connect with the core of my creative expression and my love for drawing the male nude. When I first started life drawing in 2021, my work implicitly centred around a phallic fascination, visual depictions which pointed towards the crotch, or became sexualised freeze frames of the body. This is bluntly clear in my early works on these slides, Study Sketch of Penis, Consumed by Bliss, and Take Me to Church. When I began my fine art degree at the RCA in early 2025, this sexualised focus on the physicality of the male form was still abundant in my work. My pieces often incorporated blunt imagery of muscularised, sexualised and fantasised male forms, which had little to no conceptual meaning broader than their physicality alone. I now believe that such blunt imagery risks feeling reminiscent of the pornographic, which Lorde convincingly argued, and I quote, is a direct denial of the power of the erotic. It emphasises sensation without feeling. As an artist now seeking to use the male form as a canvas through which to explore multi-layered concepts with emotional depth, my use of such imagery therefore does me a disservice, as it potentially disables the reviewer from engaging with my artwork in an emotionally meaningful way beyond literal, imagined, or projected sensations. Today, my practice is situated in a space in which I increasingly focus on the energy and relationship between the self and the other in a manner which is naked, vulnerable and open, but doesn't rely on heightened sexualization to create direct impact through shock or arousal. For example, I recently added conceptual depth to my works by drawing inspiration from literature, which features gay characters or relationships, archival gay male photography, and, as always, my own lived experience. One piece which arose from this exploration includes an island called Okayness, the square image on this slide, which focuses on attraction between two men with more compelling emotional force thanks to the absence of sexualization and explicit desire. By taking the erotic, which is so often relegated to the bedroom alone, and presenting romantic attraction in the serene natural environment of a giant lily pad pond, it is better realized within the viewer, whilst also implying that love between two people of any gender is wholly natural. Similar to some of Cole Fawcett's photography, which I discussed earlier, I've started to experiment with the object in the nude as object, and resulting dynamics between the elements or subjects as mechanisms for exploring the erotic's power with more nuanced impact. My metal engraving Place of Worship encompasses all these aspects. The loosely drawn peony covering the man's crotch simultaneously draws attention away from and towards the phallus's existence, but positions it as not being the defining attribute of male identity. Turning the nude into an object of rigid solidity, which can be touched and held, implicitly mirrors the rigidity of both the muscular form and an aroused man. And the diptych design creates an energetic tension between the existence of two parts of the same whole, not dissimilar to that of two lovers in relation to each other. The erotic is present, but with greater depth hidden in plain sight, ensuring that in this piece, pornography and eroticism are kept distant as two diametrically opposed uses of the sexual. Moving on to my most recent drawings, both Gavin Dobson's and David Hockney's artworks, employing environments like domestic showers and the bedroom, inspired me to create my own piece which represents a moment of intimacy in everyday life. I drew this diptych called Embodiments of Love, using still images which were frames from a video I took of my fiancée showering at the end of a typical day, because this moment, when one of us showers while the other brushes their teeth, is an everyday occurrence which speaks to a gradually built and mutually aligned intimacy of partnership. There was nothing sexualized about this video nor the depictions I wanted to create. Instead, seeing the beauty in the act of being beside each other during menial moments of daily nakedness, physically, but emotionally too, allowed me to reflect Lord's proposition of the erotic as a resource within each of us, rather than creating through the lens of the typical superficially erotic Western world perspective. By adopting this approach, I created a piece whose impact lies in the implied vulnerability of the subject's posture and the fragility of the flowing geometric forms, rather than anything sexual. To end then, Audre Lorde's text, Uses of the Erotic, played a key role in transforming my approach to depicting the male nude, initially visualizing the figure in a manner which was phallic-centric and more directly sexual. Understanding the power of the erotic when employed with nuance and conceptual depth has allowed me to increasingly focus on the energy and relationship between the self and the other in a manner which is naked, in the sense of being vulnerable and open. By looking at a few pieces of work by four other creatives, Hockney, Dobson, platt-lynes and Fawcett, we have seen the effectiveness of focusing on multidimensional aspects of intimacy as opposed to solely the superficially erotic. My work, like that of all artists, will continue to evolve, but I intend to remain continuously rooted in Lorde's framings of my deepest cravings, desires and truth when I'm creating. I hope that this talk has been of some interest to you all. Thank you again to the Erotic Art London team for having me here at Copeland Gallery today, to Kay Rose from the Royal College of Art for her support of my development, to my partner for his support here today, but most importantly to all of you for taking the time to come along. I don't think we have time for questions now, as I've run slightly over time, But if you'd like to chat further, then I'll be here throughout the afternoon and would love to hear your views. Thanks again.